Hey there, Elevate friends and family. Great to have you with us today for this week's Elevate Church online experience. Now, before we get into today's message, I just want to really double click on some of the digital impact that we're having both with our online experience and also with our podcast. Now, if you've been joining us regularly for our online experience, turns out you're in good company. In fact, you're in extraterrestrial company. Yeah, let me explain. So Butch Wilmore, who was one of the two astronauts that's been stranded for many months in the International Space Station, he was interviewed this week, and he revealed that he literally joined his church every single week for their online experience from outer space. Amazing. And in fact, during the interview, he made this point. He said, "The Word of God, I need it. My pastors are the finest pastors on or off, in this case, the planet. And to tie in and to worship with my church family was vital. I mean, it's part of what makes me go." So well done to him. But just he sensed this need to connect and be consistent, and just how valuable that was for him throughout that whole extended time in space. Now, we're really thrilled that we continue to hear from people around the world who have been tuning in and encouraging us and letting us know what God's been doing and how he's been impacting their lives. And in many cases, they are church leaders. So the impact that we're having isn't just to the individuals, it's to the groups and the people and the churches that they lead. In fact, just this month, we heard from Duncan in Kenya. Now, Duncan let us know that he actually grew up in a Muslim family, became a Christian, and he's now leading a church. And so he just wanted to thank us for the input that we're having in his life. And then we heard from Laurent in Tanzania, depends who you speak with, very controversial. And he wanted to let us know that he's been leading a church there for the last 9 years. And part of the ministry of that church is they feed and care for 200 orphans. And that the impact that we're having in his life is spilling over into the people that he's leading. So hi to those guys. Hi to everyone joining us today. It's great to have you with us. Now, depending on when you're tuning into this, we're probably about 2 weeks out, or maybe less than 2 weeks out from the Easter weekend. So today and next week, we're just doing like a mini series that is going to help us, and it's intended to help us focus on Easter and the run up to Easter. You know, in the church world, there's this kind of 40-day run up called Lent. And we're certainly in the latter closing stages of Lent. And so this week, we are launching this mini-series called The Bad Boys of Easter. And today and then next week, we're looking at two individuals who played a role in what we now focus on in Easter. Put them at odds with God. Next week, we're going to be looking at Judas. Yikes. And today, a guy named Caiaphas. And the reason we're looking at these two people is I'm convinced, and I've certainly seen this, there's a little bit of Caiaphas and there's a little bit of Judas in all of us. And so we just want to kind of unpack that and hopefully grow or continue to grow beyond that. So I want to take you through a little bit of a journey through a very short but significant slice of history. And you really need to be paying attention. So put that second screen down. Yeah, you know who you are. And just lean in to this. And I certainly pray that God's going to stir us, maybe shake our tree a little, and ultimately can see us grow. So, Joseph Caiaphas. Now, he was a high priest from 18 to 38 AD and literally was the most powerful person in Jerusalem in the slice of history that we're dropping into. I mean, literally the most powerful person in Jerusalem. He was a part of the family who had controlled the temple for the last 40 years. His father-in-law was a high priest. 5 of his brothers-in-law were high priests, and now it was him. And over this 40-year span, this family, now resting on Caiaphas, had accumulated enormous influence, power, and wealth. Like speaking of wealth, for example, Jews in the known world literally were required to send money to the temple in Jerusalem, what they called the temple tax, even if you didn't live in Jerusalem. And to give you some kind of maybe clue as to just how significant this collective amount of money was, the Roman government tried to stop it because all of this money was leaving the provinces and the places that they conquered with Jewish populations and being sent to Jerusalem as part of the temple tax. And the Romans, they wanted it to be kept where they were doing their thing. So here we have the high priest named Joseph Caiaphas, the most powerful figure in Jerusalem at the time. Well, everything was going well for him until a carpenter turned rabbi entered the pages of history, a man named Jesus. And Jesus was known for a bunch of things. He was known for his teaching, which wasn't entirely controversial because there was all sorts of religious people and rabbis and so on teaching all sorts of stuff. His problem was his growing influence. Jesus was teaching. The people that heard him teaching said that they'd literally never heard anything like this before. So whilst there was a lot of people teaching, it seemed that Jesus' teaching was on a whole nother level. He was performing miracles, which were wow, healing people and multiplying food and feeding people and so on. So his crowds continued to grow. His influence continued to grow. And that was literally the threat that the Jewish leaders felt. Jesus' growing influence. They kind of started to sense that if this continued, if Jesus' popularity and influence continued to grow, they may actually be at risk of a civil war. Now, Jesus was also kind of critical of the religious leaders. I mean, you can read about it, in Matthew 23, there's a whole thing there. Let me drop you into just one of the lines that Jesus said to the Jewish religious leaders. He said to them, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" All right. So, this thing was bubbling and kind of simmering and kind of escalating. And ultimately, it reached a boiling point when Jesus performed what probably would be considered to have been his greatest miracle to date, where he actually raised a reasonably prominent man named Lazarus from the dead. I mean, a lot of people knew Lazarus, high-profile guy. His death was well and truly known. He'd been buried, and then suddenly he's walking around again. And this was it. This set things over the top for the Jewish religious leaders, the highest of which was Joseph Caiaphas. Now, you can pick up that second device right now. If you want to scan this flow code, I'm going to drop us into John's recording of what happened next, what happened from this moment on, really, where Caiaphas and his cronies were very much suddenly at odds with Jesus, and they tried to bring Jesus down. So John records, many in the crowd had seen Jesus call Lazarus from the tomb, raising him from the dead, and they were telling others about it. I mean, why wouldn't you? Hello. Well, that was the reason so many went out to meet him, because they'd heard about this miraculous sign. Well, then the Pharisees said to each other, there's nothing we can do. Like, everyone's gone after him. But they realized there was something that they had to do. So they had to come up with a strategy. So the leading priests and the Pharisees called the high council together. Now, this high council was like the governing body, and it comprised of three groups from the Jewish ruling groups. And these three groups didn't get along. So, it was a big deal. Like, the Jesus problem was such a threat to them that they actually kind of put aside their deep-rooted differences for the purpose of coming together, united against a singular threat, this person named Jesus. So they asked themselves, well, what are we going to do? This man certainly performs many miraculous signs. So they weren't denying Jesus' power. But they said, if we allow him to go on like this, soon everyone will believe in him. And then the Roman army will come and destroy both our temple and our nation. So here we have the Jewish religious leaders. They recognize that something very, very different, peculiar, miraculous was happening in and through Jesus' life. But rather than kind of leaning into that and thinking maybe God's at work here, they only viewed this through the lens of what they were trying to protect. So they wanted to launch a resistance movement that ultimately was inspired by protecting what they'd worked so hard to accumulate. They kind of just wrote Jesus off from a personal standpoint as almost certainly going to cost them far more than they were willing to give up. And this is kind of our first lesson here. Despite what some of the brochures that you may have been given, like come follow Jesus and it's all rainbows and unicorns, well, it's literally not true. Jesus will work in you, he'll work for you, he'll work through you, but he doesn't promise a trouble-free life. And in fact, if we can learn anything from Jesus and from the early followers of Jesus, the actual decision to follow Jesus is going to cost you something. Okay. Caiaphas, it's like the boss of the bosses, who was the high priest at the time, said, look, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't realize that it's better for you that one man should die for the people rather than the whole nation be destroyed. So this group, they're saying, like, we can't come against Jesus. We can't do anything because, like, the people will go crazy. And Caiaphas is saying, no. If we let him continue, well, it's going to end for us anyway. So, like, how about we just come up with a strategy to eliminate the person, and in doing so, eliminate the threat. And so, that's kind of Caiaphas's angle. Like, if we can get rid of Jesus, it's actually going to be better for the people. Now, he said the people, but really, he didn't mean the people. He meant himself and the Jewish religious rulers. But essentially, he didn't know what he was saying. And John's the one recording this. Now, John ultimately wrote all this down when he was a very old man. So he was looking back at something that had happened decades prior. So he records Caiaphas as saying, look, it's better for one person to die for the benefit of all the people. Again, he didn't really mean all the people. He meant his own power and his peers. But John, knowing then what we know now, wrote this. Caiaphas didn't say this on his own. As high priest at the time, he was led to prophesy that Jesus would die for the entire nation. And not only for that nation, but to bring together and unite all the children of God scattered around the world. So from that time on, the Jewish leaders began to plot Jesus' death. Caiaphas, he thought he was going to eliminate the threat. He did not know when he said those words that he was going to light the fuse for Jesus to be the most influential person in all of human history. Even today, 1/3 of the people on the planet profess a faith in Jesus. But Caiaphas ran into a challenge. You see, because they were occupied and under the rule of the Romans, they didn't have permission, because even though they're Jewish, they were, like Roman citizens. They didn't have permission to kill somebody for breaking a Jewish law. In fact, the only way someone could be killed is if they broke a Roman law. So Caiaphas and his mates had to come up with a Roman law. Like, what's a Roman law we can accuse Jesus of? Because if we can somehow get the Romans to be convinced that Jesus broke one of their laws, then they will actually be obligated to punish him under Roman law. So they came up with the idea of sedition. Now, I don't know if you've used that word in a sentence recently. Basically, in this context, it's like they were accusing Jesus of being an enemy of the state, the Roman state. Claiming, quoting, pointing to that Jesus had on occasions referred to himself as being a king. And whilst technically the Romans didn't have kings, they had Caesars. As the Roman Empire continued to go on and Caesar after Caesar came and the Roman Empire grew in power and significance, some of the Caesars actually started seeing themselves as kings. And some of them even started referring to themselves as kings. So for Caiaphas to point out to the Romans that there's a guy running around Jerusalem and the outskirts calling himself a king, look, you guys need to do something about that, because that is not cool under Roman law. So they had Jesus crucified and ultimately buried in a tomb. Caiaphas and his friends could rest easy because the threat had been eliminated. Well, that wasn't until maybe like 3 days later, I can picture someone running down the corridors looking for Caiaphas, finding him and saying to him, "Sir, the Jewish rabbi that you organized to be crucified, the body's missing." And a few days later, Jesus' sightings were being recorded all across the area. A few weeks later, Jesus' closest followers, who had actually gone into hiding, were now out and about in full force, screaming and yelling at and about the Jewish leaders that they were the ones that had Jesus crucified. So this threat that they thought that they'd eliminated and that the people would just kind of go away quietly, it was having the exact opposite reaction. So what's a lesson that we can learn here? And I think there's many, but let me just drop on one. So Caiaphas and the Jewish religious leaders, as I mentioned, they acknowledged that Jesus was doing incredible things. Like, they used the term miracles. There's no denying it. I mean, when someone that they would have known, a guy named Lazarus, they knew he died and now he's back out in the wild, living, breathing, walking. They not only couldn't deny that, they didn't even try. They acknowledged this. But again, instead of acknowledging God was at work, they tried to resist God because it was going to cost them too much. Now, here's my statement in the run-up to Easter. And this is one of the things that should actually be a head scratcher. If you're a follower of Jesus, have you ever resisted him? Have you ever resisted doing what he's calling you to do? Have you ever resisted following him in ways, in places, in directions that, you didn't want to do? Have you ever resisted him? Because here's the bonkers thing. We too often resist the God we say we trust. We say, yeah, I know I should forgive, but look, yeah, I know I should get out of that relationship, but I know I shouldn't go there. I know I shouldn't say that. I know I shouldn't do that. I know I shouldn't spend my money that way. But, and we have our own kind of private kingdom that we want to kind of keep Jesus out of, or at least keep him right on the periphery. But consider this. If you're someone who calls yourself a Christian, in other words, you've invited Jesus to be the Lord of your life, you've asked him to forgive your sins, you've said, I put my trust in you, you're actually trusting him with your eternal salvation. Nothing is more important. And yet, the bonkers thing is, while we trust Jesus with our eternal salvation, why do we sometimes resist trusting him with our money or our career or our relationships? Why do we tell Jesus, in this area, you're not the boss of me? But here's the problem. While saying yes to God will cost you something, saying no to God will ultimately cost you more. And if you were to survey people on the planet, even like people who aren't Christians, and ask them if they've heard of a guy named Caiaphas, there would be a few, but not many. Because literally Caiaphas has been relegated to the footnote of the history of Jesus. For Caiaphas, ultimately resisting God cost him everything. And we don't want to be those people. So here's my question. About to drop the mic. In the run-up to Easter, is there anything that you've been resisting Jesus in? Is there any area in your life that you've been trying to keep Jesus at a distance? And if so, hey, can I encourage you, can I invite you to consider opening up your hands and letting him in? Because his way is always